Good afternoon and welcome to the Clare, Boothe, Luce Center for Conservative Women, where we empower young women to live happier, freer lives. My name is Kimberly Begg. I am the president of the Luce Center. I am also a product of our important work. I've been involved with this wonderful organization since I was a college student at Rutgers University. So for our C-SPAN audience today, I would like to take a moment to share what we do here at the center and why it's important. First, a little background. A Luce Center poll recently found that today's young women hold naturally conservative beliefs, but often hide them to avoid conflict with family and friends. Here at the center, we help young women embrace their naturally conservative beliefs. Our formative programs include internships, summits and seminars, campus lectures, and this event, which is our Conservative Women's Network Luncheon, which features accomplished women leaders who present a compelling vision of womanhood, family life, entrepreneurialism, and American patriotism. To put it simply, we bring young women together in a spirit of friendship to give them the courage and confidence they need to live and lead as conservatives. Today, we are delighted to have a very special group of young women with us, our impressive summer interns. I would like to ask one of these lovely ladies to help us kick off today's program by leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you would all please stand, I would like to ask Olivia Haley from the University of Florida to come to the podium.
I pledge allegiance to the United flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. And now to introduce our topic and speaker. Today, we will be delving into the fascinating and also very timely and controversial topic of the moral considerations of in vitro fertilization. As Allie Beth Stuckey, one of our students' favorite speakers who will be joining us at our June Washington, D.C. Summit and our November Nashville Summit has said about this topic, the truth is, most people haven't thought about the reproductive industry beyond yay babies because it's uncomfortable and unpopular to do so. She's right, and that's one of the reasons we are so grateful to Emma Waters for joining us today, because she is someone who has thought about this important topic a great deal. Now, regardless of your background and views on this complex topic, I think you will appreciate Emma's thoughtful insights about bioethics and the moral questions raised by technologies that create human life. Emma is the Senior Research Associate at the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family at the Heritage Foundation. She is a former visiting fellow with Independent Women's Forum, a monthly contributor with World Magazine, and the 2021 recipient of the American Enterprise Institute's Young Scholars Award. Her work may be found in First Things, at Fox News, in Newsweek, The Federalist, Washington Examiner, among many other outlets. Emma graduated valedictorian of Lee University with a double major in political science and biblical and theological studies. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and their daughter. Now, after Emma's talk, we are going to have an opportunity for Q&A. We will pass the microphone around. So please wait until you have the microphone before asking your questions so that we can all hear you. And we will also have a lunch, and I'm really hoping that all of you will join us for lunch. So please join me in welcoming Emma Waters.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Clare Boothe Luce Center for the opportunity to share with you all today on this very timely topic of bioethics and in vitro fertilization, and particularly how we as women should think about this issue. So, as I begin, I want to take a moment and recognize that there is a strong likelihood that either you or someone that you know is here because of in vitro fertilization. Either they use the technology or they were born from it. And so, at the very outset, I just want to underscore and highlight that every single child, regardless of how they're conceived, is made in the image of God, the image and likeness of God, and is filled with all dignity and is worthy of all respect. So, this conversation today isn't in any way addressing or demeaning those who have used the technology or are created from it, but instead is inviting us to think more deeply about how the technology functions today. So at Heritage, I lead our bioethics and reproductive technology platform. And something that I like to highlight is that Heritage does not have an official position on in vitro fertilization itself. We neither support the practice nor do we oppose it or want to see it banned. Instead, we're deeply concerned about the abuses in the fertility industry and the lack of regulation that oversees a practice responsible for the creation of human life. And so it's from that perspective that I'll begin our conversation on in vitro fertilization today, so that we can really think about not only the practice of in vitro fertilization, but also the fertility industry that's behind it. So, ever since the Alabama Supreme Court decision in February, which ruled that for the purpose of a wrongful death, frozen embryos are considered persons, the topic of in vitro fertilization has been front and center in the public eye. It is an understatement to say that it caught most people off guard, from our elected leaders, the pro life movement, and even many pastors and normal Americans across the United States. Unless you yourself have walked through infertility or been with someone who has, it's unlikely that you've really engaged with the industry or learned much about how the practice works. Indeed, most people seem to hold the view, like Alibeth Stuckey says so beautifully, that IVF creates life. Therefore, it must be good, and we should support and practice it with no limitations on how we do so. For this reason, you will see both senators and pastors alike say we are pro life and pro IVF, and offer no clarifications or no deeper understanding of what it really means to be pro life or pro IVF. And my concern is that maybe it's not so simple, and that there's a lot more we have to consider about what it really means, or what in vitro fertilization really means, and what the fertility industry really practices. So, as we dive into this issue, it's important to keep in mind three key things about IVF. First, it is a highly lucrative, multi-billion-dollar global industry that profits from the creation and selection of human life. Second, IVF is a powerful technology. It is less than 50 years old, and like all technology, it has the power to shape us and how we think about children. Third, these technologies are increasingly marketed toward young women in hopes of harvesting their eggs to freeze them for later use, or for egg donation for other couples who may need them. And of course, the industry often encourages women that it doesn't really matter what life decisions you make. You'll always have IVF down the road. And yet, unfortunately, many women find out later that that's just not a promise the industry can keep, and feel lied to in the process. So today we will discuss these three questions. So the first question is, what is the fertility industry and how does it function? The second is, how does IVF as a technology shape the way we think about children? And third, how should we as young women think about our fertility, our reproductive health, and in vitro fertilization? So to the first topic, what is the fertility industry and how does it function? So, as I mentioned, it's a highly lucrative, multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States alone. Globally, it's estimated to reach between $23 and $30 billion annually. And it's a practice that's available in almost every country, although the United States is a particular hotspot for our advancement in these technologies. The industry is often dubbed the Wild West of reproductive technology. And when you hear this phrase, what it's referring to is the fact that there are very few regulations that govern the practice of IVF in the United States. We only have one federal regulation that was passed in 1992 that governs IVF, but it only deals with clinics reporting their success rates. And it doesn't even have an enforcement mechanism. So, this is meant to hold clinics accountable so that there's no false advertising. But even that regulation needs a lot more beef behind it to actually protect parents and the children that they create. And then beyond that, IVF is only primarily governed on the state level. So you have some states like Louisiana that have prohibited the destruction of embryos once they're created. You have Colorado, for example, who actually banned anonymous egg and sperm donation because they believe that children, regardless of how they're created, have a right to know who their parents are, not just for the sake of their medical history and who they potentially marry one day, but because children have this inherent desire to know where their nose comes from and where they get their sense of humor and what their family history is. And so we have a few laws like this in various states, but for the most part, it's only viewed as a medical practice or a reproductive technology that we have the right to access. And I want to highlight here that to regulate something is in no way to prohibit it, right? We have regulations on absolutely everything in the United States, from how cars are made to how fast food businesses can market and sell their food, even down to the speed limit. So when we talk about regulating IVF, we're not talking about prohibiting the practice. We're simply talking about ensuring that parents and the children created through it are provided the highest standard of medical care, and that medical care includes strong ethical protections so that human life is being protected at all stages of development. So, the first area of the fertility industry that I want to talk about today actually deals with the egg and sperm donation movement. So, the word donation is a bit of a misnomer here. Men and women are not simply donating their egg and sperm, they're selling their egg and sperm for quite a bit of money. And in turn, the clinics that buy the egg and sperm are then selling it to potential parents who hope to use it to create children. So, to give you a little bit of background on how the process works, when a man or a woman goes to sell their egg or their sperm or egg, respectively, they oftentimes look at their background information. They say, where did you graduate school? Are you very athletic? How tall are you? What color is your skin? What are the sort of strengths or skills that you have? Are you an expert in this area? Are you classically trained in piano? And depending on where you fall among those demographic backgrounds, the more or less you get paid. So on average, men will get paid anywhere from $100 to a few $100s to donate their sperm. And there's no limit on how many times they can donate, which means you have a lot of men who do so frequently. And women, on the other hand, it's a far more involved process, as you can imagine. So for women, we naturally create one egg per month. But when you're selling your eggs, the fertility clinics are hoping to extract as many eggs as they possibly can. So I know a few weeks of you, some of you heard from Mary Margaret Olohan and her recent book on detransitioners. And one of the primary drugs used for detransitioners to quote unquote block puberty is something called Lupron, which you may have been familiar with. Well, Lupron is also an off-label drug that's used in the egg extraction process because it stops your hormonal process and allows them to artificially manipulate it. And so Lupron, the same thing used in transgender puberty blocking surgeries, is also used in egg donation. So what happens is they use rather harsh hormonal drugs and artificially stimulate a woman's body to create as many as 35 eggs at one time, which is an insane number of eggs, especially when you keep in mind that when women are born, we are born with the total number of eggs we will have for our entire life. We don't just keep reproducing them like men do. So once those at most 35 eggs are collected or stimulated, they do something called egg extraction, which I won't go into any more detail, but basically they take a syringe and will manually extract them from the woman's body while she's sedated to protect her from the pain. But if you remember from the New York Times Retrievals podcast series that came out, there are things that can often go wrong. And a lot of times women experience a lot of pain and discomfort in that process alone, not to mention the hormonal stimulation and discomfort that comes with it. And at the end of the day, the process itself is actually it's very difficult for women. So there are a number of side effects that can come from these harsh hormonal drugs and so many eggs being created at one time. And so the first is something called hyperovarian stimulation, which is where all of the extra fluid that your body creates stays there and can actually cause life-threatening conditions because your body's not meant to have that much fluid within your ovarian section. But it can also do things like increase chances of breast cancer or even increase the likelihood that you yourself will struggle with infertility later on. And I say all of this to highlight that many times when women are sold the image of donate your eggs, help a family in need, this is a win win. You can help a family have children, and then you get paid enough money to help cover college or to help a down payment on a house or to pay for medical school. And this is how it's oftentimes presented to women. And at the same time, these sorts of difficulties that come with it, these risks that women are taking, are oftentimes hidden or they're not fully explored, putting women in this compromised situation where they've agreed to undergo this very invasive surgery, but don't fully know what they're signing up for. And it's really important to note that the amount that women can get paid ranges from anywhere to of $10,000 to $70,000. And imagine if you really need some money and someone says, I have a way that you can do that by donating your eggs. That's incredibly tempting. So, a fun fact that I like to tell people is that it's actually illegal per the law to for credit card companies to advertise on college campuses because they recognize that college students oftentimes make pretty foolish decisions with their money and maybe shouldn't have an unlimited card put in their pocket. And yet, there are no laws that actually limit egg donation clinics from advertising on college campuses. So, you will frequently see, especially at Ivy League universities, these pamphlets from egg donation clinics saying, women, if you donate your eggs with us, you can make $20,000, $25,000. Jennifer Law, who's done a lot of work in this industry, posted a picture yesterday where one promised $70,000 if you met the qualifications they were looking for. So this is just a massive, highly lucrative industry. And again, as with the men, they're looking for women who are Ivy League educated, who are very athletic, who are tall, and in some cases who have light skin and blue eyes. And so the discomfort there of like the eugenics that can blend into it is certainly present. And to make matters worse, if you're familiar with a dating app where you swipe left or swipe right, depending on if you like the partner and you like the information listed, that's how parents choose their egg donors. They're given either a book that they can look through or even an online list, and they can swipe through different women and say, do I want this woman as my egg donor? Yes, no. Well, I like that she has this characteristic, but I don't love this about her. I guess we'll go on to the next one. And so there's just a lot of very morally complicated things that are introduced into the process. So from here, I think something that is just really important to consider here is that the resulting children from egg donation are not your problem. They're not able to be signed away because you've signed a contract saying that these eggs are no longer yours or that you've leased these eggs to a company to sell. But ultimately, women who donate their eggs are sending their genetic material into the world. They're sending 50% of themselves to another family to use. And yet they have no idea who the family is or what could happen to the child. And so I think it's really worth considering in these conversations what the moral responsibility is of women for their genetic material and men for their genetic material. I think we have a responsibility to ensure that the children that come from us, even in part, that we've done the best that we can to ensure that they have a good life. And something like egg and sperm donation, you have absolutely no control over what happens to that information, to that genetic material once it leaves. And what makes it worse is that some states don't even have laws protecting that egg and sperm from being used in research later on. So when you thought you were potentially donating egg and sperm to help a family in need, it could eventually actually be used in genetic research that may certainly violate beliefs or comforts that you have with this practice. And so to really highlight some of just the funny things, weird things that can happen here, is you may all have seen the recent Wall Street Journal story about the man who has over 200 children and counting because he's been donating sperm for many years. And for a long time, he just thought about it as a way to make a little extra money, help out women in need. But then one day, one of the children who had his sperm, who was his son, reached out to him and it clicked. These are my children. They're not just my sperm. They're not someone else's kids. These are my kids. I can see my eyes in that kid. He has the same color hair. She has the smile that I have. This one looks like my mother. And so it just overcame his senses. And now he is on a mission to get to know all 200 of his children. And he's traveling across the United States, reaching out to every family that he can find because he wants to know the children who have come from him. He wants to be a dad to them. And yet, I think if he had thought about that on the front end, he may have reconsidered his role in the fertility industry in donating sperm, because ultimately, legally, they're not his children. He's not going to have the ability to grow up with them and to get to know them in the same way that I think he wants to. And that's just some of the unfortunate things that come from, I think, a thoughtless enthusiasm engaging with this industry. But enough on egg and sperm donation. Let's transition to in vitro fertilization, which is ultimately what happens to egg and sperm once it's been extracted. So at the most basic level, in vitro fertilization involves the taking of sperm and of egg, placing them in a petri dish in hopes that the sperm will fertilize the egg and result in an embryo. An embryo being a distinct, unique, and living human being, albeit at the earliest stages of its development, but a human being nonetheless. There are many variations of in vitro fertilization, things like artificial insemination, which only involve taking sperm and implanting it in a woman. And there's also things called GIFT, or gamete intrafallopian transfer, where you do take egg and sperm from a man and woman's body, but you actually don't let the moment of conception occur until it's within the woman's body. So they take a catheter and they place the egg, then they put an air bubble, and then they place the sperm before inserting it in the woman's body. So this is what Vice President Mike Pence, he and his wife used. It allows you to do single embryo creation and keep it as much within the woman's body as possible. But overall, old school in vitro fertilization accounts for about 99% of all reproductive technology procedures in the United States. So to give you a little background, a single round of IVF can cost anywhere between $12,000 and $30,000. Here, a round refers to the process that doctors follow to create the embryos. So taking the egg, taking the sperm, and then creating as many embryos as they can. So it is estimated that on average, it costs about $72,000 for a couple to successfully have a child with IVF. It may take multiple rounds of IVF, anywhere from 2 to 16 rounds before they're able to successfully create and birth a live child. And others discontinue their efforts because they simply run out of money. So this is a process that requires not only a lot of spiritual and emotional and physical toll, but also a lot of financial toll on the parents. So once the eggs are collected, either from the man-woman couple that they will go to or by a donor for same-sex relationships or single persons, doctors will fertilize the egg with the sperm to create embryos. Once the embryos are created, about 80% of the eggs will result in a live embryo. So if you have about 6 eggs to begin with, you'll probably end up with about 4 or so embryos once you fertilize them, because not all of the times will it work. And then once an embryo is created, parents only have 5 options before them. They can implant the embryo in hopes of conceiving a child. They can destroy the embryo. They can freeze the embryo. They can donate the embryo to research, which is effectively the same thing as destroying it because that's the end result. Or they can place the embryo up for adoption through embryo donation. So in reality, there are very few options for parents once they've created these embryos. Additionally, I think what many people don't realize when we talk about in vitro fertilization is that IVF involves the routine destruction of embryos, either intentionally or through neglect or through the natural process where embryos simply cease to grow and develop. Clinics will often create a surplus of embryos to test them for the best genetic profile or to select embryos based on their sex or even their eye color. This is advertised widely in California. Clinics routinely will destroy unwanted embryos and then may freeze some for later use. And in many cases, there are just profound moral issues. So, of all clinics in the United States, 75% of clinics offer something called pre implantation genetic testing. And this allows clinics and doctors to actually genetically assess the embryo. And depending on the way that they go about this, they can assess the sex of the embryo, the eye color of the embryo's intellectual aptitude, how smart will this embryo be? And they can even assess things such as the genetic makeup. Is this child going to have a disposition towards autism? Are they more likely to have Alzheimer's when they're older or Down syndrome when they're born? They can assess all these host of factors and then present parents more or less with a printout of what each embryo's makeup is and what each embryo's pros and cons are, depending on what they're looking for. And the problem with this is that the availability of embryonic genetic testing will all but guarantee the creation and destruction of embryos in pursuit of a certain kind of child, whether that's based on the sex of the child, as a recent Slate article explored, or potential physical and mental traits, as many couples in Silicon Valley use them for, or the potential of inheriting a disease, which is probably the most common reason that parents will use IVF, even if they're not infertile. So they're hoping to avoid an inheritable disease that runs in the family. So, how many embryos are created each year, and what is their success rate? So, preliminary data from the CDC in 2021 shows us that there were about 238,000 patients who went through about 413,000 assisted reproductive technology cycles, primarily IVF, at clinics across the United States. And in all, there was just over 97,000 children born from those reproductive technology treatments. So, of assisted reproductive technology treatments, over 1 million babies have been born to date using IVF. Another 1 million embryos remain frozen in the United States. Considering the total number of live-born infants divided by the total number of IVF cycles, this means that overall, IVF has about a 23 to 25% success rate, taking all women into account. Yet for women who were 40 years of age and older, who are often relying on IVF, their success rate is less than 10%. What these numbers do not include, however, are the total number of embryos created per round of IVF. And they don't track the success rates for the children who were involved. So unfortunately, there are no widely recommended recommendations on how many embryos to create at a given time. From reports that I've read and people that I've talked to, on average, a cycle of IVF usually creates about 10 to 15 embryos at one time. And then from there, parents have to decide what to do with them, whether they're testing them or if they hope to use them all. And as you can imagine, most people aren't hoping to have 15 children. So there's a built-in number here where they're either going to have embryos that don't implant or they're going to have really difficult decisions to make about the embryos involved. But we were curious about how many embryos were created per year and looking at the bigger picture from the perspective of the child involved. So if we say that on average, there's about 10 embryos created in a round of IVF, and we know that there's about 413,000 cycles, then what we're looking at is, on average, an estimated count is that there are 4.1 million embryos created every year in the United States. 4.1 million embryos. And yet only 97,000 children are born from these procedures. Which means if we ask ourselves, what is the success rate from the perspective of the embryonic child involved? We're looking at around 2.3%. So for the embryos, the success rates are very low indeed. And it's worth noting that when we're talking about it from the perspective of the child, this is including the entire range of outcomes. Embryos that failed to implant, embryos that perished in the process, but this also involves the embryos that are willingly destroyed, either through negligence on the clinic's part or because they didn't fit the right kind of genetic or sexual makeup that the parents were looking for. So, I want to briefly consider just a few of the moral and ethical concerns that then come with it. Because while it may seem obvious that parents who undergo IVF want to create embryos to have children, children that they love and children that they desire, oftentimes the fertility clinics have a different goal. They're hoping to implant the right kind of embryos with the highest chance of success because ultimately that helps their business model and that helps them attract new customers in the future. So, fertility clinics in many cases may practice IVF with the eugenic assumption that some embryonic children are more deserving of life than others. Clinics often provide parents with predetermined packages that aim to create as many embryos as possible to test and select the healthiest ones and discard the embryos that are unwanted or deemed not good enough. And so it's an open question for many Americans, whether they're religious or not, what it looks like to engage in an industry that oftentimes has so little respect for embryonic human life. And I'll talk with reporters all the time, and they'll say, well, of course, we don't want to destroy embryos based on the sex. I mean, that's so communist China. We're nothing like that. But what if the child could have Down syndrome or like be really sick throughout its life? I mean, that's a good enough reason, right? And this is the calculus that a lot of people have. And very firmly and very lovingly, the answer is always no. That is never a good enough reason to select or destroy a child, simply based on their potential to succeed in some way or another throughout their life. So, a few resulting moral quandaries from our practice of IVF. The first is that you can end up with fathers who have hundreds of children that they've spawned through sperm donation, or mothers who have multiple children, though usually it's less given how involved the process is. This also opens the question of unknown siblings and dating relationships. In some small towns in the Midwest, they found out that there were about 30 children who were half siblings because they had all been created using the same sperm donor, but didn't know it. And so through 23andMe and other genetic testing, they started to put the pieces together. But some of these half siblings had dated because they came from totally different families who had no relation and they didn't know they had used sperm donors. So you have a question of, should you take a genetic test before you consider marrying someone so that you don't find yourself dating your third cousin by accident, depending on the area you come from, which is kind of funny, but like is actually a problem in some places. The other is the presence of embryos that are frozen for decades at a time. So recently, in the last 2 years, there was an embryo that had been frozen for 30 years and an embryo that had been frozen for 25 years that was successfully implanted, gestated, and born. And so you have a baby who's technically been alive for 30 years just start the process or just continue the natural process of development being born. Very weird stuff. And then you have two stories of friends of mine who live in the Northern Virginia area. The first friend of mine was conceived through in vitro fertilization. She ended up being born in a set of triplets when her parents were really struggling with fertility. They were a bit older in age. And once they had those three triplets, they decided that that was enough. And so when this friend of mine reached her mid-20s, her mom came to her one day and said, "Hey, I don't know how to have this conversation with you, but we actually have frozen embryos left over." They had been paying a few hundred to about $1,000 every year to maintain them. and they had no idea what to do with them because they viewed them as their children and didn't simply want to destroy them, but they also were far past childbearing age themselves. So she came to my friend and said, "Would you be interested in using these embryos? Is this something that you want to give them a chance at life?" But these are her siblings that we're talking about. So the mother was uncomfortable with embryo donation because she didn't want a stranger having her children, but also there's no clear answer for what to do. And ultimately, my friend said no. She felt deeply uncomfortable with the prospect of burying her siblings. But now she too has to live with the knowledge that she has siblings frozen on ice and has no idea what to do with them. And another friend of mine, she's also in her mid 20s and told me her story of her conception. So her parents, for many years, were deeply concerned because a pretty strong inheritable disease ran in the family. And they were terrified of having children with this disease because it would basically mean full time care around the clock for the continuation of that child's life. So they decided to turn to IVF, even though they weren't struggling with infertility, so that they could genetically test the children involved. And so she lives with the knowledge that her parents created countless embryos before they selected her and her sister. And so she is lucky to have not had this genetic disease. And she is lucky that her parents chose her, and she's incredibly happy to be alive. But she has to live with the knowledge that she has many, many siblings who were destroyed simply because they didn't match the model that they were looking for. And these are really heavy and heartbreaking stories that countless men and women across the United States are having to learn how to emotionally process and consider, where they're very grateful to be alive. They love their parents and their parents love them. But there's a lot of really uncomfortable questions that they're left with considering because of the unregulated and unconsidered use of this technology. And of course, the outcomes of IVF are not neutral for children. Children who were born through IVF have a higher likelihood of cancer, autism, minor cleft palate, and even congenital heart defect. As bioethicist Oliver O'Donovan argues, there is a world of difference between accepting the risk of a disabled child, where that risk is imposed upon us by nature. It's conceived that way, and we had no role in it. And there's a difference between that and ourselves imposing that risk in pursuit of our own purposes. So, intentionally creating children knowing that there's a higher chance that they're going to suffer from additional physical or even emotional problems because of the choices we've made. And so, for many couples, especially those who value and protect life from the moment of conception, they have to submit their own desire to be a parent to the well being of children and even practice that act of unconditional love before the child is ever created to ensure that they're loving and doing what is best by the potential children far before they've started the process. So, then to briefly consider IVF as a technology and our reproductive health broadly, there are two bioethicists that I have found particularly helpful. The first is Oliver O'Donovan, who wrote an incredible book called Begotten Not or Made, thinking about what it means to be begotten, as scripture talks about, versus what it means to be made, as we often speak of making children in vitro fertilization. And so the framework he gives us to help assess the merits of a given reproductive technology is that, does this technology restore the natural body, or does it circumvent the body's natural order? This analogy has limitations, but it's very useful as we're thinking about reproductive technology. So let's imagine a couple experiencing infertility. There are two approaches a doctor can take. First, the doctor can address the common underlying causes of infertility, like endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome, through medical treatments such as hormone therapies or surgical interventions. And this approach aims to restore the natural body so that it can then conceive and bear children. But if they're still unable to conceive, many couples consider things like in vitro fertilization. And so one of the things that he points out is that in vitro fertilization, the couple remains just as fertile or as infertile as they were to begin with through the entire process. IVF treats our desire for a child, but it doesn't actually treat the infertility in our body itself. So, in some ways, IVF tends to circumvent the problem altogether and aim to fix it through another means, which isn't necessarily to say that people decide that that circumvention is wrong, but just that it's not actually restoring the human body as much as it is turning to another procedure to create life. And the second example is that of Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher who wrote the book The Medium is the Message, which you may read in philosophy classes in college. And so, what he says that I think is so profound is that we cannot simply assess a technology based on what it literally does, right? Like a train moves from point A to point B. But he says you have to assess a given technology based on the psychic and social consequences that it bears on society. How does this technology shape and reshape the way that we see the world? And so ultimately, the railway and the train system opened up the entire West and allowed for Western expansionism that we know today, and opened up an entirely new way of building cities, making that the central part of it. So he says when we think about trains, we don't think about trains and what they literally do. We think about trains and how they reshaped our cities. In the same way, when we think about IVF, we can't simply think about it as egg, sperm, creates embryo, and we hope there's a baby, though that's the technical process. But we need to ask ourselves, how does this reproductive technology actually shape the way we think about children and the way we think about childbearing and our fertility? And is it potentially encouraging us to bring unhealthy assumptions to the table that we need to be very, very careful in considering? Primarily, that we have the right to create certain kinds of children and reject other kinds of children. And of course, as you know, it is not necessary in IVF to destroy human life. There are many people who practice IVF in ways that are ethically good. So, Rejoice Fertility in Knoxville, Tennessee is a clinic that I think embodies this incredibly well. So, they work very closely with parents to assess their ultimate needs and desires, to understand the underlying causes of infertility. And they have strict policies where they won't destroy embryos, they don't test them for their genetic makeup or their sex. And they work really closely with an embryo donation clinic so that if there are leftover embryos, they have a chance of going with parents. Or you can use things like natural IVF or single embryo IVF, where you're creating a limited number at a time to ensure that each of those embryos is being cared for and has the opportunity at life. And those are approaches that I know many, many Christians or just thoughtful people in the United States have used. And then finally, how should we as young women think about our fertility, reproductive health, and IVF? And this is something as we're closing that I really want to highlight is that your fertility is not outside of your control in the way it is so often talked about. Your fertility is well within your power to steward well and to be very wise in how you approach this. And so there's something something that I think is worth admitting that I think has concerned a lot of women, especially, is that infertility rates are rising in the United States and across the world. According to the CDC, there's about 11% of women in childbearing age who are infertile, and about 9% of men within childbearing age who are also infertile. And in the United States alone, our birth rate has just dropped to 1.6 children per woman, which is well below the 2.1 replacement rate necessary for a functioning society. So there are many people who are very concerned about their chances of having children. And so when it comes to how we talk about infertility, the medical diagnosis of infertility is either for women 35 and under, if you have 1 year of unprotected intercourse and aren't able to conceive a child, then the medical diagnosis you receive is infertility. For women over the age of 35, that window is only 6 months. But that diagnosis of infertility does not actually tell us what infertility is. So, contrary to common belief, infertility is not a disease in and of itself, but it's a symptom of an underlying condition that makes it difficult or impossible to conceive. But it's worth noting that statistically, about 94% of women will at some point have a child, regardless of a diagnosis of infertility, one way or the other. So, examples of these underlying conditions for women include things like uterine fibroids, endometriosis, PCOS, your lifestyle, environmental factors like your chemicals, or other like perfumes that you use that can mess up your hormonal balance. It can have to do with your male partner fertility if he's not fully healthy. And then there's a list of other reproductive conditions that follow this that the CDC outlines that's about like this long and little tiny text. And basically pointing out that your underlying conditions that can result in infertility are oftentimes the mix of anywhere from 3 to 4 different factors at one time. For men, it can include things like low sperm count, low sperm motility, poor diet, poor health, and substance abuse with marijuana or alcohol. But the thing that is so encouraging to highlight in the midst of this is that these are conditions that can be healed, reversed, or improved, if not fully healed, with proper treatments and lifestyle changes. Many of these underlying causes of infertility are not a nail in the coffin for your hopes of having children. It just means you're going to have to go through treatments, and it may take a little longer than you initially hoped to conceive children. And so, this should be a thing of great hope for many women that your only option isn't IVF if you're lucky, but that there's actually a lot of treatments that can be done to help your body be as healthy as it can be. So, some people, if they have endometriosis or PCOS, are able to receive the necessary treatments and naturally conceive children. Other times, they still use things like in vitro fertilization or other reproductive technologies. But the thing that's so important to note is that if you first address the underlying causes of infertility, your IVF success rates are going to be way higher than they were before because now your body is in optimal health to not only create the embryo, but to gestate and birth the embryo. And the same goes for women. And so, as we close, this area of medicine called restorative reproductive medicine aims to examine the whole human person and how a woman's reproductive functions and cycle interact with the rest of her body. Infertility can affect as many as 1 in 4 women in the United States. But the good news is, as that restorative reproductive medicine that tackles these underlying causes can eliminate barriers to successful conception and pregnancy. And it can also alleviate other difficult symptoms that are associated with reproductive conditions, such as painful periods or flare ups, bloating, inflammation. Many of the symptoms women have been told are normal, that are in fact not normal, and can be treated with the proper health care involved. And so there's a growing interest among women to proactively assess their reproductive health and see how all of their lifestyle factors, their health information, ultimately shapes both their reproduction, but also their future fertility. And so my encouragement for you today is to not wait. Ultimately, when we're talking about the rise in infertility, maybe just the reality is that the rise in infertility in many cases has to do with the rise in childbearing age. As more and more women delay marriage and delay childbearing until their mid to late 30s or even their 40s, as is incredibly common here in DC, you're seeing women who find it a lot harder to conceive, but not because they have an underlying condition or this unavoidable prospect of infertility, but simply because they're a little bit older and their body wasn't prepared to try to have a baby in that season of life. So what's worth noting is that about 5.8% of all children are born from IVF in the District of Columbia. The national average is 2%. And what you have in DC are a lot of women who prioritize their career before family and then find it's a lot more difficult later in life to conceive. And so my encouragement for you today is that your fertility and these difficult topics are well within your control. Prioritize marriage and childbearing in your 20s and 30s. Look for ways to improve your reproductive health. Talk to your doctor. Push back when they say that symptom is normal and you know it's just not normal and it's really painful and you would like it addressed. And really fight for yourself in those moments because ultimately women are worthy of the highest standard of reproductive care before they even come close to a diagnosis of infertility. And same for the children who were involved. If we do go through a process like in vitro fertilization, those embryos are worthy of the highest standard of medical care. and their life from the moment of conception matters and deserves all of the protections and respect that we ourselves would like and expect to receive as adult human beings. So ultimately, children are a gift and not an act of the will. They're not a right and not a right that we can demand simply because we desire them, but they're a gift that, with open hands, we are blessed to receive. So, thank you very much. Yes.
Hi. I was just curious if you've seen any research on the outcomes of like siblings who are conceived through IVF, like if the family has one through IVF and then they have another naturally, like is there sort of any kind of tense relationships between the siblings or even differential treatment from the parents?
Yes, this is a really good question. I've actually just started to look into this question of the children born through IVF and the sibling relationships. The unfortunate reality is we don't really track outcomes for children born of IVF beyond the moment they're born. So, the CDC, through the one federal regulation I mentioned, does track the child's well being at birth. But beyond that, we don't actually have any long term studies that assess the overall well being of children or look at the family dynamics. So it's a really good question and one that I'm really interested in, but we just actually don't have many studies to help us answer that question.
Hi, I appreciate all the information you gave today. It's incredible. I do have a question, and this is something that goes beyond IVF and encompasses the entire healthcare of women, and especially as it pertains to reproductive healthcare. But there seems to be a major issue with informed consent.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, it's fallen on organizations like Heritage or even churches to inform women on what their rights are and what happens when these procedures take place. Can you speak to that a little bit, and how can we tackle that beyond us doing it individually and maybe moving the healthcare industry towards that informed consent?
Yes, this is an excellent question. And you're certainly correct that the question of informed consent is a major problem when it comes to in vitro fertilization and certainly egg donation in particular. So there's a few things that I'll say to this. One is that we do have a couple of states that have passed laws requiring very strict informed consent procedures with women or couples undergoing IVF, where you have to sit down and say, here are the health risks. Here's the reality of what's happening. Or in IVF, right? Like we're going to create as many embryos as possible. Are you okay with that? Would you prefer us to limit the number of embryos? And just freeze the eggs and try again. So, those sorts of questions, a few states have regulated and required that. But for the most part, again, this is a wildly unregulated industry where there's ultimately very few requirements in place. And something that we were actually just talking about before this is egg donation in particular. Women who are donating their eggs aren't actually considered patients. And so they're not being tracked like you would another patient undergoing a surgery. So we actually don't have a clear idea of all of the side effects and outcomes and how likely they are when a woman donates her eggs, either for someone else or for her own in vitro fertilization process. So one law in Arizona went so far as to say that when you are having the informed consent conversation, part of informed consent has to be that we don't fully know what we're asking you to consent to. And you don't fully know what you're consenting to when it comes to your overall health and the potential outcomes. And same with in vitro fertilization. Erica Anderson, who's written very beautifully on this topic, recently had a piece in the Wall Street Journal where she talked about experiencing infertility and undergoing in vitro fertilization. But now, looking back on the process, she talks about how she just wasn't told how the process really works. She didn't know they would create as many embryos as they could. She didn't know there were alternatives to try before turning to IVF. So now they have multiple children frozen and aren't sure what to do with them. And so it's one of those difficult moments where she says, I wish I had had informed consent for them to sit down with me and say, hey, just so you know, like these embryos, if you decide not to use them, you only have a few options. And those options are to destroy them, to freeze them, or to donate them to someone else. And I think that that conversation is so lacking and leaves many parents feeling very gypped by the industry because they weren't fully aware of what they were signing up for. I think we have a few.
Okay, last question here.
I personally know of 3 men who found out, had no idea that they had been, IV babies,
Mhm.
and found out through this 23andMe, other people contacting them,
Mm.
and both of them were devastated. This is not my beloved father. This is, and it was very, very tough on
Yeah.
these guys, very tough.
Yeah.
And one ended up going and meeting his father and, finding out there is a reason why I'm 6'5", in my family. But
Certainly.
but it was very difficult for both of these fellows, very difficult,
Yeah.
Yeah. Discover these really aren't my beloved parents.
Yeah, and I think these are conversations that are just going to become more and more common with 23andMe, with parents finding out that the children they thought, or the parents that they thought were theirs, aren't theirs. But on the flip side, if you all have seen the Netflix documentaries on fertility fraud, where there are sperm doctors who actually use their own sperm in the place of the donor's sperm or the father's sperm. And so the doubly heartbreaking moment where fathers realize that they thought they were the biological father of their child and aren't, and obviously love them, and it changes nothing in that, and yet does change something because there's this importance of a biological connection with our parents, especially when we have been told that or believe that our entire life. That can feel incredibly violating to learn that someone either knowingly or unknowingly has taken that from us. So yeah, I think there's a lot more of those heartbreaking stories that are going to become more common. And those are the kind of stories that I think are going to encourage lawmakers to consider strong regulations around this practice to ensure that both parents and children are being protected as they seek answers to infertility.
Yeah. Thank you. Emma, that was wonderful. Very informative, very well stated. Let's give Emma Waters another round of applause. And it is a tradition here at the Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women to gift our beautiful mug with our absolute favorite quote by the great Clare Boothe Luce. The quote is, "Courage is the ladder on which all the other virtues mount." For a very courageous conservative women. Thank you so much, Emma. And please join us for lunch.